Good morning, and thank you all for coming out early this morning and fighting a bit of a cold to hear from us and hear from my team. I'll begin by introducing our very dynamic team from all parts of the country. I have Masha on my left-hand side from Ontario, Charlotte Ann from the East Coast, aka the Best Coast in Newfoundland, Carl from Alberta, and last but definitely not least, Anna from Quebec. And I'm Zach, yes, I forgot about me. I'm from the center of your favorite cinnamon roll, aka Toronto. Our team has had the great pleasure of participating and traveling across our beautiful country. We've been to 5 study tours, and we've met with farmers, politicians, lobbyists, non-governmental organizations, and more importantly, we've met with the Indigenous community about their ideas about the future of food for Canada. And we've also had the great pleasure of slicing and dicing into the pineapple of making informed food choices. For instance, the average Canadian household spends roughly $8,000 on food every year. And our team as a whole, during our conversations with Canadians, have begun to wonder, how was it ethical? Is it good or bad for the environment? And during a lot of our conversations with Canadians from various backgrounds, the concerns were wide-ranging, and because of this, we began to dive deeper into what it would take to help Canadians make more informed food choices.
Exactly, and we really came up with this project because of questions that we ask ourselves. We asked ourselves perhaps before this program, but certainly even more because of it. So how can we make better food choices? What information are we relying on now? And what information are we missing? So in order to conceptualize what a different reality would be, what an informed food choice would look like, we considered our own experiences and those of the people we met on our study tours and in our consultations. We also looked at what existing information about food is out there, so things like the Canada Food Guide and nutrition labels, the variety of things that Canadians care about when it comes to food, and also the major areas that Canadian food choices impact. And we did that by looking globally, certainly, but mostly within Canada. And what we did is we distilled into 2 categories. So what we have on the outside of our model is the realities that frame food choices. And then on the inside, the second piece is the categories of information that interest Canadians. So I think what you'll see on the outside perimeter, affordability, availability, and values, I think speak a bit for themselves, so we're certainly happy to answer questions about it. But the core of our project and of this model is really the 3 categories you see in the middle. So health and safety, the environment, and sociocultural. So Carl, tell us what we look at when we think of health and safety.
So for health and safety, we're looking at general food knowledge, nutritional knowledge, which would affect health and well-being, as well as food skills, so the preparation of safe and nutritious meals.
And what we've really learned is that's the focus of existing food information, and it's a pretty well-defined and accepted dimension of food choices, whereas the other 2 are more emerging areas. So Masha, when we talk about the environment, what do we mean?
So in this dimension, we really think about environmental impact and sustainability of the food we choose to purchase. And factors like land and water use, packaging, transportation, or impact on biodiversity in the local area would come into play here.
And I think we can all appreciate that climate change is a growing concern amongst Canadians, and certainly it's a stated priority of this government. But I think it's also important to note that it's a growing market opportunity. 50% of consumers who were polled in 2015 worldwide said that they would be willing to spend more money on a product if they knew that the company making it was committed to positive environmental impact. The problem, though, is when you're standing in the grocery store or somewhere else and you're thinking of buying a particular product, you don't necessarily know what the environmental impact of that product is. And really there is a difficulty here, partly because there's a lack of data about environmental impact. There's no standard or regulated source of that information. And it also depends on what metric you use. So, for example, if you're considering water use, you might come to a different decision than if you're thinking about biodiversity. So these are difficult questions, and we really have found that the considerations around environmental impact are gaining traction. We saw that in the new Canada Food Guide mention of that. And the same can be said about the sociocultural dimension, which also figured in that new Canada Food Guide. Donc, je me tourne à toi, Anna, pour nous parler un peu de ce qu'on veut dire quand on dit la dimension socioculturelle.
En fait, la dimension socio-culturelle fait référence au processus par lequel un aliment ou une pratique alimentaire devient culturellement ou socialement acceptable pour un individu, et ce, en fonction de ses valeurs. Les valeurs peuvent toucher autant la production, la transformation ou la consommation des aliments. Un bon exemple serait l'apparition d'un logo cachère ou halal sur un emballage d'un produit alimentaire qui signifie au consommateur que ce produit a été préparé selon les croyances religieuses d'un groupe.
Et pendant nos consultations, ce qu'on a découvert, c'est vraiment une sous-représentation de cette dimension-là. Un exemple qui nous a vraiment frappé, c'est un exemple qu'on a reçu à Toronto. On parlait avec une femme qui travaille avec un service de traiteur avec d'autres femmes immigrantes à Toronto. Et puis, elle nous a dit que leurs enfants vont à l'école et là, ils sont exposés au guide alimentaire. Et que quand ces enfants-là se sont rentrés chez eux et mangeaient les mêmes plats traditionnels qu'ils mangeaient avant, tout à coup, ils disaient à leurs parents « ça goûte pas bon, c'est pas santé, ça ». Et ça, pour nous, c'est vraiment un exemple où on met l'accent sur la valeur nutritive et puis ça peut avoir un impact négatif sur d'autres éléments. Et vraiment, pour nous, l'idée de notre modèle, c'est que les Canadiens et les Canadiennes auraient accès à l'information qui traite sur ces trois dimensions-là. Ce n'est pas la décision comme telle, mais c'est la façon qu'on prend cette décision-là. Donc, ce qu'on imagine, c'est être au centre de ce modèle-là, et c'est ça qui rendrait un choix au sujet des aliments qu'on consomme, un choix plus éclairé. So with that model in mind, we're now going to present to you 3 recommendations we think would bring us closer to those kinds of informed food choices.
Thank you, Charlotte. So this is the most interesting part of the presentation, what we can do about our food choice. How do our group thinks we can advance in that area? And the scope of our work was really focused on the access to information. So the way we arrived at the 3 recommendations was by, studying different case studies, looking within, what works really well within the 3 dimension and what works well internationally. And with that in mind, I'm going to start with our first recommendation. It was inspired by a few things. First, every product, this really lovely chocolate fondue for Quebec, and every other prepackaged food here in Canada has a nutritional facts label since 2007. And in fact, most of Canadians are actually consulting that when they make their food choice. Another really cool example comes from the US, where since 2015, there is an industry-driven initiative called Smart Label, here on the right. With products that participate in this program, you can use your cell phone to scan a QR code or look it up on your computer and get access to much more than just nutritional information about the product you're about to purchase. And we see that those labels are really important in getting access to information. Next slide. So with that, we want to recommend, our first recommendation would be to say that Canadian government and industry should work together to create a standardized and interactive food label with an associated online platform. And so this food label will provide information on nutritional value, but also other things that would include environmental impact and relevant sociocultural information. In this partnership between government and industry, the government would play a role in maintaining the platform, identifying what is the information that's going there, monitor and evaluate the success of this program, and receive feedback from consumers. Now, the industry would play a role in adding this information on their packaging and providing the relevant information to this label. Now, what we think this recommendation can do is really improve Canadians' access to relevant and already pre-existing information on the foods. But for this recommendation to be really successful, for this label to be successful, it needs to rely on robust data.
And what we've seen is there is a lot of data and a lot of research within health and safety, also within some of the areas around our three dimensions, like the economic pieces, price, availability, those kind of things. Where there's not as much information or research is in the environmental and sociocultural dimensions. And in order for Canadians to use these dimensions, we need to better understand them. We need more of that information, which leads to our second recommendation, which is that governments support research to identify and assess environmental and sociocultural dimensions of food. We see this sort of as a three-step process. So first we need to identify the gaps. We need to know what information do we have already and where are the gaps within that. There's a few ways to do that. We think that expert panel might be a nice way to start. Within the second step, it's the gathering of the information. We envision this as a partnership between federal, provincial, territorial, and possibly departments such as AAFC, such as Environmental Climate Change Canada, Canada Heritage, possibly others. Within this step, we also envision broad consultation. So within government, outside government, academia, industry, civil society, quite broad. The third step is the dissemination of that information. Now that we have it, we want to get it out. Stakeholders need it. We could also use it to improve the food label you just heard about as well. This could be an integral part to the success of that food label. And lastly, we would want this information to be publicly available. We think it's valuable and would help Canadians make better food choices.
En ce qui a trait à notre troisième recommandation, c'est une recommandation qui nous est apparue lors de nos échanges avec les différents intervenants sur le terrain. En effet, on s'est rendu compte que les différents intervenants, autant de la société civile, de l'industrie ou même du gouvernement, ont tendance à évoluer dans leur sphère d'influence, ce qui fait qu'il y a peu d'échanges entre ces groupes et que donc l'information alimentaire qui est présentée aux Canadiens et Canadiennes, elle est souvent polarisée, voire fragmentée. Un bon exemple, le nouveau guide alimentaire canadien qui met de l'avant les protéines végétales au lieu des protéines animales. Vous avez sûrement vu passer quelques articles et eu des débats avec vos collègues. Donc, c'est le genre d'informations fragmentaires et polarisées qui peut amener les Canadiens et Canadiennes à trouver difficile la sélection des aliments. Afin de remédier à la situation, nous recommandons donc la mise en place d'un forum national sur l'alimentation qui regrouperait des acteurs de différents milieux afin que ceux et celles puissent échanger et développer des politiques alimentaires qui sont beaucoup plus inclusives. À cet égard, lorsqu'on a eu notre voyage d'études à Montréal, nous avons eu la chance de rencontrer la présidente de Concera, qui est un forum brésilien qui regroupe autant des acteurs de la société civile, donc on parle ici de communautés ethnoculturelles comme les Afro-Brésiliens, communautés autochtones, des leaders de l'industrie, mais également des décideurs publics, qui se rencontrent dans ce forum de manière périodique afin de parler, d'échanger sur des thématiques ou des défis auxquels le Brésil fait face au niveau des questions alimentaires. Une année, le thème qui a été choisi a été la création, ou plutôt la mise à jour du guide alimentaire canadien-brésilien qui, comme certains d'entre vous peut-être le savent, est devenu un modèle en la matière. Et une grande réalisation du modèle de Concera, c'est l'inclusion au guide alimentaire d'assiettes qui sont balancées, qui représentent en fait la diversité ethnoculturelle du Brésil. Et nous croyons que ce serait bénéfique pour le Canada d'adopter un type de forum similaire. Et afin que cet exercice fonctionne, on recommande que le gouvernement fédéral mette en place un forum, donc qui le soutienne financièrement, mais également qui participe de manière active et qui travaille de concert avec ses homologues provinciaux et territoriaux pour qu'un exercice similaire soit répété dans les provinces et les territoires. L'avantage d'un tel forum, c'est qu'on va non seulement être capable de créer un lien de confiance entre les différents intervenants, mais on va également pouvoir répondre à des questions d'ordre ponctuel, telles que la mise à jour du guide alimentaire canadien, mais on pourra également s'intéresser à des questions qui nécessitent une réflexion profonde, et ce, à plus long terme. On pourrait penser, par exemple, à la sécurité alimentaire dans le Nord.
To recap, here's what was on today's menu of recommendations. One, an interactive food label and associated online platform. Two, research because we need more data. And three, a food policy forum to increase dialogue. We now would love to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Over to you, please. Suzanne, I'm sure you have a question.
Well, I have several questions. So I'm Suzanne Vinet. I was one of the advisors, so I never got to meet you, but I have a keen interest in agriculture. I should come clean. I'm the former Deputy Minister of Agriculture Canada, and I've worked all my life in agriculture. So this was very interesting to me. And I'm going to use this opportunity actually to say how impressed I am by all three reports. And this is just really quite incredible what you've come up with. Because most of you are not coming from this field. You tackled this cold, and I was very impressed to see the evolution from your first drafts, what you were thinking you were going to tackle, to where you landed. You landed in a very practical way to things that I think government can pay attention to, and that are very, very concrete recommendations. So specifically, I know you met the executive at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada earlier in the week, so I would be interested in having your takeaway on that kind of meeting. What did you walk away with? What kind of sense of priorities, or did you feel, what were the main issues that you were enthused about when you came out of that meeting? Just your general impressions, basically.
I'll start. Thanks for the question. Definitely there was a lot of interest around what different stakeholders were saying. So there were a lot of questions around, when you talk to farmers, what did they say? When you talk to this group, what did they say? Because they do that as well. They do a lot of consultation, a lot of focus groups, a lot of surveying. And so they're very curious about, what the results were, and which we shared, and which some of them are in the report, some aren't, and that kind of thing. So that was my first impression anyway.
I think throughout our consultations, we've really felt like this is a concern of Canadians, that having a better diversity of information is a concern. And so it was interesting to see that is very much on the agenda in the department, and that I think all three of the topics that we chose actually ended up being things that they were already thinking about. And I think that the model that we're talking about in terms of a food forum really does build on some existing initiatives, so it's not perhaps surprising that sort of it spoke to some of the things that they are already thinking about doing, but it doesn't exist, and I think that really is something that we could create that would address some of those concerns. And I think something that really does also come across, and it certainly came across in the questions, is how do we ensure, how do we define the government's role in this, and how do we ensure that we're playing with the other actors in the space? And agriculture, as in many industries, it's a big business. Yes, it's a decision that individual Canadians make 3 more times a day, but it's also a big business with big companies playing, and small farms, and just such a diverse array of players in that space. And so what can government's role be? And that's something we really thought a lot about in this group. Is we didn't want government to come in and regularize what social and cultural practices are around food. That wasn't something that we ever wanted, and yet we did want there to be something more accessible, and that does involve a certain amount of standardizing. So I think that's where we ended up with this model of a food label that's interactive. So you're creating the platform, but not necessarily the decision itself, or telling people what they should do. You're making it possible for them to take in a greater variety of inputs into those decisions. So I think those are some of the takeaways we took. Thank you.
Maybe I'll go next. Let me begin by echoing Suzanne Binette's comment on the quality of this, and say when the former deputy minister is happy in department land. That means things are pretty good. Second comment is that we're at a little bit of a funny spot here because we're asking questions to the panel with our back to them. And so what I call on you all to do is keep an eye on these people while I ask a couple of questions. And if you see any funny faces, then we will mark them down appropriately. So just rat them out. So I have two questions for you. So first, with regard to your recommendation on labeling, as I bet you remember quite well, the last time we had a big talk about labels was an advocacy-driven effort to get a lot of Canadian agricultural products labeled as GMO products with the intention of vilifying them in the marketplace and trying to disqualify them from European markets. And so that was quite a big discussion. And what you're proposing to do is to go down the road of a smart label process in which advocates of those kind of approaches will want their stuff in the labels. And so what do you have to say about that? What do you have to say about the possibility that this labeling proposal is going to get us right back into that debate about, for example, labeling canola, a principal Canadian agriculture product, as a frankenfood, which was what the debate was in the EU not too long ago, etc. How do you think that the government should manage that? Because it will definitely be a pressure. My second question is, on page 7 of your paper, you note that the principal concern of the public about food is its rising costs. Now, this question of the quote-unquote rising cost of food basically is driving an awful lot of the innovation that actually happens in agriculture. For example, it gets you to 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 sow pig barns that are designed to produce pork in the marketplace as cheap as possible. But the tone of your labeling proposal is that people should be aware of these kind of practices to consider other alternatives. So you're on a bit of a horns of a contradiction in your paper here in a way, because you acknowledge that people are most concerned about food, and yet your labeling proposal is trying to draw people away from what they're after, which is cheap food. And cheap food gets you to those kind of practices, and it ultimately drives you to distribution systems like Walmart, for example, which compete in the Canadian marketplace with a lot of food taken from other countries. And so how do you resolve that contradiction, that your first recommendation kind of mitigates against the key fact in your second?
Brian, thank you very much for these questions. I'll take the first one on labeling. And
Masha,
I'll
can
bet
I
the second one.
just ask you to go a bit
So-
closer to the mic?
Closer?
Thank you.
Okay. So, labels are definitely controversial, and people can send their specific message across if they want to. So in the US, the smart label system is really industry driven. And so it's industry who decides what are the certain categories that they will present, etc. And they're running this thing. The reason why we wanted to involve government in the Canadian version is to, make sure that and not just AFC necessarily, a number of departments, that we want there to be an interest for the consumer. So this whole report is really about the consumer and what does consumer need to make informed food choices. What is the consumer? What are the concerns that animate the consumer, etc. So we see the role of government here to have the best interest of the public, and identify what are the main things that people want, and really be driven by that rather than what industry wants to show. So that's the main thing. And I understand even at the government tables, there's lots of tensions between different departments. Is it health concern or agriculture? It's complex, definitely. But we do find that because there's so much polarization in the food field in general, that we need to really think who the customer is here and what they need, and address that. So, and also once the interactive label that Canadian government and industry will start going, we really see a very strong monitoring and evaluation angle here from the government to see what's working, what do people actually want to know, and if there's something that they don't want to know, maybe it shouldn't be there. So This is really kind of how we think it should work, kind of in a more neutral way, and having people's best interest at heart. And yeah, I'm going to probably just pass it on to Charlotte.
So I think for your second question, Brian, I think it's worth highlighting something that really came across in our study tour, and we've had many conversations about, but which is not the focus of this report. So it perhaps is important to say, and it is that throughout our various study tours, the question of economic inequality was a recurring concern. And people from a whole variety of different sectors across the sort of food space told us, if people have the means, this will solve so many of the problems. And so, sure, we can say that about so many social ills, about housing, we can say it about education, we can say it about so many things, if only you can afford a better life for yourself. And that includes a life with the food that you want to eat. And so I do not want to diminish the importance of addressing economic inequality as something that will, yes, affect our ability to make more informed food choices and our privilege to choose the products that we want to choose. And I really do think that that's going to come across as an underlying reality in the other two presentations as well. So do not want to diminish that. I would also say that the research about what Canadians are concerned about is limited. We could basically find one organization in Canada doing that research. And so, yes, they are, so it's the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, and they are doing that research on a recurring basis. And so there is, it's neat to look at their research and see sort of how it changes, but they are one organization doing that research. So there may be other concerns, but I think the big difference is that research about what Canadians are concerned about and what goes into their food decisions is what is happening right now. But our policy recommendations are about changing that reality. So the environment at the moment and the things that you get to think about when you make a food decision right now are limited. You look at the nutrition label, you see the price of the food at the store, but you may not have other inputs of information to inform you. So I don't know whether in a different world, hopefully also a more economically just world, but in a different world where there is more access to information from in these different dimensions, whether people might make different choices and might put as a concern and put as something that will inform their choice in a more significant way, the environment or their culture. But that's just not something that they necessarily have access to right now. So I wouldn't assume that that which is a concern of Canadians right now will always be the same top concern when there's more information put before them.
I'm sure there are more questions from the panelists. I just wanted to remind everyone that we have Slido. We have already a question on Slido, so it's SLIDO. You don't have to download anything, and the hashtag is Action Canada. And also start thinking about a question that you might want to ask in person. There are mics here. Back to you.
I was a mentor for Task Force 1, so I had a chance to ask some questions throughout the year, so I'm going to pass now.
Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to have been part of the journey. I was one of the advisors along the way, and I was just touched down every few months and got to meet this wonderful group of individuals. And I think if Canada's in the hands of these future leaders, I think we're in a good place. I was very impressed. I have two comments that lead to two questions. One is on the form, and one is on the substance. I'm always amazed by how important the form is. And one of the things that I found that was very compelling is the form of your presentation and the form of your report. People are very pressed for time. And one thing I really liked about your table of contents is it told me what your recommendations were right from the get-go. And I thought that was a very important start to a very good presentation. So thank you for that. My other question on form, though, is that you may have the best ideas in the world, and this is not required of your report, but I just want to probe if you've been thinking about this. Today marks the end of your fellowship. But if you were given this report, what would be your comms and GR, government relations strategy, to get these ideas closer to fruition? So that's the form question. On the substance question, this is where I have a deep love of agriculture and been in it my whole life, like Suzanne, and both as a producer and as an academic and as now a policy person. And I'm wondering about the ambition of trying to get indicators in the environmental area. Because your environmental might not be my environmental, not because we disagree, but because we disagree on what's important. So what the area I work in, and we do quite a bit of work in the environmental sustainability area, there's actually a pentagon of issues. And the pentagon of issues are water, soil, air, greenhouse gas emissions, and biodiversity. And oddly enough, you don't have very often policy measures which will advance all of those at the same time. And I wondered if you had any thoughts as to how we pick one of those. If we can't have them all, are there more important environmental indicators than others? Or do we do the best we can? Do we muddle through? What advice can you give to policymakers who will be taking this?
They are here. Thank you for the question, Don. I'll address the comms and GR. I got a nod from, our member in the middle from Newfoundland to jump in. And it's because it's been a lot of what I've been doing recently. So for our comm strategy, our short-term comm strategy, in my humble opinion, would be to get some op-eds written about our work, get some more awareness done around our subject matter and around some of our recommendations, find key stakeholders who are willing to publish some of our work, whether it's policy options, the National Post, the Toronto Star, and then looping back in with some of our stakeholders that we met along the way, whether it was Food Share Canada, when we met them in Montreal, the Center for Food Integrity, and see if they even want to co-write something with us that we can share with the public. A long-term comm strategy would be to possibly roll out a website, create a bit of a blog, and then start getting the key stakeholders who've been supporting our project thus far to start writing about some of our ideas. And moving to the GR strategy, based on the purview of what our ideas would fall under, for example, the health and safety section, in which we wrote about in the report, falls under the provincial government as well. So seeing who we know in the province, who we may have already spoken to, building out an Excel spreadsheet. I'm getting too much into the weeds of things. But federally, looping back in with some of the stakeholders we've met from AFC, and we just presented to on Tuesday, those who asked particular questions around our idea for the policy forum, and looping the folks who did the food policy consultations and what they've learned from that arena. And then locally, based on the municipality or the city that we're from, finding those key community organizations in the nonprofit sector who want to address an issue like the need for more data to address socio-cultural dimensions. We share in our example, I believe, of the Syrian community throughout our report, and then also making sure that locally we tap into the Indigenous community and the knowledge that's there around food. So that's how I would break down a bit of our GR strategy, and then also, more importantly, lean on the strengths of our team, as we have people who work in different levels of government as well.
Puis, en fait, si je peux rajouter un commentaire super rapide sur l'implication gouvernementale, moi, ce qui m'a frappé quand on est allé j'essaie de trouver l'acronyme en français, Agriculture Agroalimentaire Canada, c'est qu'il y a plusieurs recommandations qui ont été présentées par notre équipe, mais par d'autres équipes qui ont trouvé écho dans des initiatives ou des projets qui existent. Sans que ce soit similairement la même chose, c'est quelque chose qui pourrait se rassembler ou pourrait être amené à être agrandi. En ce qui a trait notamment au forum pour discuter des questions alimentaires, on a souligné le travail exceptionnel qui a été fait au niveau des activités de consultation qui a mené à la nouvelle politique alimentaire du Canada. Puis eux-mêmes ont reconnu que ce type d'exercice de consultation inclusive, qui s'est fait sur une période de temps beaucoup plus échelonnée, a été très bénéfique pour le développement de cette politique alimentaire. Donc, lorsqu'on a mentionné cette recommandation, par exemple, il y a eu un vif intérêt à prendre le rapport et à prendre l'information qu'on leur a fournie pour peut-être mener à la création, et là, je vais sonner très gouvernemental, là, mais d'une TV sub ou d'un MCU cabinet. Bref, il y a déjà en place un intérêt au sein même des institutions gouvernementales pour nous appuyer dans la démarche.
Excellent. I would love to take the, oh, sorry. There's a, more answers.
Yes. So just to add to this question, I think the important thing is that these recommendations really add value to the consumers, to the Canadians, and so, you know, we really need to show that and get buy-in from different communities. Public Policy Forum has been terrific at already kind of shopping around our reports and inviting people, you know, to this presentation and to others. So that's to your point. But I think the most important thing is not that promotion, but you know that there's we're coming from a different place. We don't have any interest like behind us. It's really coming driven to add value to Canadians, and that's pretty neutral. Now, and then after you form alliances and you make sure you show that. To your second point about environment and the difficulty in finding the right indicator that will please everybody, that's impossible. We're going to follow what happens in Denmark. They have announced that they will, you know, be looking into creating like a label on foods that would kind of indicate what environmental impact the food has. It's the first country that we know of that's going to do that. That's been passed by the Parliament, and now it's in the execution stages with their Agriculture Department. So be looking at that, but you know, because it's for consumers, I think it should be really driven by people's needs and desires rather than, you know, from interest groups or from different farmers necessarily. Thank you.
I would love to bring the one question that we have from Slido, because I know that it's a question that you actually thought quite a bit about. And so I'm just going to read it to you. Why use consumer choice to move the food industry towards sustainable choices? Why not guarantee success by using legislated requirement instead?
It's a good question because there are several levers that can influence consumer and business behavior. What we found in speaking to different people and businesses and other stakeholders within the value chain was that a lot of what happens is pretty classic supply-demand economics. I'm sure there's many economists in the room where consumers are truly driving a lot of the behavior. But the caveat to that is that it's not just Canadian consumers. And we saw this very explicitly on the prairies when we were out there in the fall, which is that so many businesses now, especially in agriculture, are export-driven. And within the supercluster out there, that became very clear to us right away, that that's not about feeding Canadians, it's about feeding the world. And so there's a lot of different factors going on here that come back to the economics of it, of the business. So this is a huge, huge business. And so from our lens as of today, the five of us not necessarily being experts, not nearly as expert as some of the folks sitting right in front of us, that's the approach that we think would be most effective and probably the most efficient as well.
Thank you. Questions from the audience? Yeah.
Good morning, Maxime Legault-Méran with Food and Consumer Products of Canada. Thank you very much for your presentation, highly interesting. Again, full disclosure, I'm representing the industry, so food processors, for example, food manufacturers. Just a comment and a question. First of all, for the labeling, a smart label, very glad to see this recommendation. I'll add that on that our industry is taking steps to implement smart label in Canada, voluntary steps. I know in the US they've taken a lot of initiative in 2015, but in 2017 we've launched it. There's a website, limited number of products. But there's a lot of consumer goods there, but the industry is trying to, and I find it interesting, your recommendation to include government around that. Now on Smart Label, as you're probably aware, there's also a big recommendation piece around front of pack labeling that the government has been proposing in the last couple of years. And I was wondering if your recommendation was around that, proposing an alternative to front of pack labeling. So if you could give me a little bit more of context on why you came out with smart labels. Thank you.
So I'll just start with a comment, and I think Masha will probably have more to say on this, but when we were thinking about informed food choices, we were actually thinking about making that choice richer. We weren't actually thinking about telling people what they should and shouldn't do in a faster, more directed way. I think we as a group certainly did not ever consider additional front of label packaging. And I think the reason that wasn't something that we as a group were thinking about as much is because it's just not the kind of information we're talking about. We aren't talking about telling Canadians this is something you should or shouldn't eat. And we're not talking about saying this is environmentally friendly, this isn't. I think what we're thinking about more is how can we make that a richer decision. And frankly, and here I really am speaking for myself, there is a certain kind of confidence I might have in a product when I see the front of it that says, for example, it's fair trade and I'm buying a piece of chocolate and I know something about the conditions of some workers in that industry. But it's such a narrow and value-laden kind of label. And I think what we were interested in is making the environment in which these decisions are made richer and more informed. And I don't think that we're ever going to get all of these things we're talking about onto the front of a label, but we might get a sign that says they are providing more information to you. We might get, the code on the front of it, and then it's up to the consumer what aspect of that information they go out and seek, and then what they choose to be important to them. Masha? I agree with that.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Krista Hiddema, I'm an academic, area of animal and environmental matters. I had the opportunity to speak with all of you, so thank you. I love your suggestion about food labeling. I do remember years ago the governmental fights around that, and it didn't end up turning into what I think many of us wanted. But what I'm really interested in is in the food labeling area, we all know that the greatest impact on our environment is animal agriculture. We've all read the UN report. Livestock's long shadow, and the only real way to reduce environmental impact is to leave animals and other animal products off our plates. That's a pretty firm science. So I'm wondering if you're combining food labeling together with environmental concerns, how do you suggest we inform the Canadian public that the only real way to reduce environmental impact is to simply stop consuming animals?
I think, and this is, I might sound like a broken record because this is a little bit what I said to the previous question, but it really is fundamental to our approach, is that we are not trying to dictate the answer in this particular project, but rather make it possible for people to ask more informed questions. And so maybe it will be that you go to the store and you pick up a product and you consider the water usage, you consider the land use, you consider whether it is of particular social importance to the environment. You may come to the conclusion that study you said brings you to, but you will have done it as a consumer who is owning that choice. And I think there is a difference between that process that people go through where they come to believe in the choice they are making in their consumption, as opposed to being told you can't eat that, you should eat that. And it's really in those spaces that I think it gets a little oversimplified. And one of the examples that's in our report is, and I'm sure you've heard this example before, but it's around the way in which some Inuit communities think about wild meat. So you can think about it simply in terms of this is a meat product, and there is value in eating a non-meat product, and that is important perhaps for your health, perhaps on certain environmental metrics. But that also doesn't necessarily bring into play the other ways in which people think about food. So for the Inuit community, for example, seal meat is not just something that has nutritional value, but it's really important to physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. And that kind of a holistic way about thinking about food certainly doesn't come on most front of label packaging, and frankly, I don't think it's ever going to come from our government telling us that. That's a very personal, value-driven decision.
The other piece that I would add, and this is just a general comment that doesn't address the question, but is just that part of what we're talking about is a consolidation and a more efficient way for information to be either gathered or disseminated. I'm sure many in the room have gone through this exercise of, okay, what should I buy, where should I buy it? Again, if you have the economic privilege to do so. And within certain areas, and we mentioned not environmental, sociocultural as much, but within certain areas, boy, there's an amazing amount of information. It's truly a cacophony. And so part of our efforts is that consolidation and that streamlining of the information for Canadians.
Thanks. I'm afraid we're running out of time. It's a concurrent theme in our programming because there are always more questions than there is time. I'd just like to thank Task Force Number 1 for their presentation, and first of all, applause. Thank you, and I will